So today we're going to be talking about sponge filter maintenance because like every other fish tank filter out there, there are multiple components that go into making this particular filter function, and they need to be checked on and maintained in order to maintain optimal performance, because there's a very big difference between this and this. In this video, we're going to be going over multiple diagnostic steps in order to figure out where in the system of your sponge filter the performance is being degraded. Now, in one of those clips, I showed a sponge filter that was working properly where there was a ton of air bubbles, which indicates good water movement as well, because that is a sign that there is no restriction in the system. Now, in the other video, I showed you a sponge filter that was not producing a lot of bubbles, which means somewhere in the system between the pump and the very end of the sponge filter, somewhere air is being restricted, and when that happens, that also restricts the amount of water that can be moved because the system isn't performing as optimally as it should. So let's start from point A to point B. So this is the sponge filter in question that we are going to be working on today. Now, most people, when they see a low amount of air bubbles, they assume that it has to do something with the air pump. Perhaps maybe a diaphragm inside the pump is going bad. There's an easy way to check if this is the case, especially if you have a dual diaphragm pump. So what we're going to do is consider the air pump, point A, and the water outlet portion of the sponge filter, point B. Obviously, we have to move air from point A to point B in order to move the water. So the magic happens here in the air pump. If the air pump is not pushing air for some reason, such as, like I was saying before, perhaps a diaphragm has gone bad, you'll need to change that in order to restore performance. Now, if you have a dual output system like I've got, the easiest way to check it is simply to take the line out and feel with your finger. Is it moving air? It should be pretty apparent if it is or isn't. Now, sometimes they can move a little bit of air, and sometimes they can move a lot of air. If you have a dual output, try switching the connections and see if the other diaphragm in the system restores performance to your sponge filter. If it doesn't, then the problem is probably not the pump. It's somewhere along the way from point A to point B. Now, another thing you can do if you have a single diaphragm pump, meaning there's only one output, is simply take the airline hose and blow through it with your own mouth. Now, the reason we're doing this is because you as a person should be able to feel any restriction of air when blowing through this tube with your own mouth. And right here we have the sponge filter. So if we blow through this, we should see a bunch of bubbles coming out of the outlet of the sponge filter. But if you feel that you really have to force air through with your lungs to get air from this end of the hose to air coming out of the outlet of the sponge filter, that may indicate, and most likely does, that there is a blockage somewhere, maybe between the hose or within the sponge filter system. And now we're going to have to go from point A to point B a little bit further down the line. So next thing to do is to check if there are any kinks in the airline hose, because if you have a bend or a kink like this somewhere along the way, that is going to restrict air very much, and that will not allow the system to function properly. So if we were to do the same test, now, as you just saw, I was blowing really hard through the hose to force air to come out of the outlet of the sponge filter, making water move. But as soon as I put a kink in the airline hose, that air no longer could make it properly to the outlet, and thus the flow was restricted. So the next thing to do is to check for any kinks in the airline hose, as that will dramatically reduce or even kill the performance of the sponge filter entirely if the kink is very, very bent. So once you've done that, see if that is the issue, and if it's not, next we have to start looking at the sponge filter. So at this point, if there's no problem with the air pump and there's no kink in the airline, we'll have to start deconstructing the sponge filter. Now this sponge filter is working just fine. As you can see, a ton of bubbles are being moved through the outlet, and thus a lot of water is being sucked through these sponges, pulled up and pushed out as well. But if we go over here, you'll see the bubble force is very much less than what we were just looking at. Now here's the thing. I've done some basic testing here. I've tried other air pumps and got the same amount of air coming through. I've checked the hose for any kinks, and there are none, which means there's something in the sponge filter. Now, the sponge filter is made up of several different parts. The next obvious thing to check is the sponges themselves. They provide what's called mechanical filtration, meaning that any particles that are larger than the pores in the sponge will be caught on the sponge, which means as things, over time, as things build up on the sponge, it provides restriction, and that means water won't be able to get through all the crud that's built up on the sponge filter. So what you're going to want to do is take some tank water out of the tank and then take the sponge filter off of the connection and give it a little squeeze to try and remove any detritus that has been built up on the sponge filter. In order to do this right, we need to use the water from the tank. And you might be wondering, why do I have to use water from the tank to clean out the sponge filter? Why couldn't I just go to the sink and rinse it under there? Well, here's the thing. The water in your tank has a bunch of that beneficial bacteria that helps cycle your filter. And when you squeeze the filter, you're going to be removing some bacteria as well along with the detritus, and you want to try and make sure the water that it's rinsed in has some of that bacteria for it to soak back up into, as well as making sure that you don't rinse this off in something like city tap water, which contains chlorine and chloramine, which can kill the bacteria on your filter, ultimately killing your cycle in your tank. So, more reasons to use your tank water. In order to do this, all you need is some Airline hose if you want to be crafty, or you can really just get water out of the tank however you feel. But this is a neat little way of doing things, and this is a simple trick to acclimating fish as well, but it works in this area of aquatics too. So we have the Airline hose put in there, and all we got to do is create a little bit of suction on this end. And water comes out and will be poured into the bucket. And once the bucket's got enough water, we can clean the sponge filter out. Okay, so we got our bowl of tank water, and now we need to remove the sponge filter from the tank. Now, as you can see, I got a bunch of shrimp buddies, so I got to be really careful not to hurt them. Basically, this thing just slides right off, but I got to coax these little guys to come off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide this off of the plastic frame, and you can see all these holes in here. That's where that's where the water comes through the sponge into. I'm just going to gently pull this out. I'm going to shake it. I'm going to twist it around to coax any shrimpy buddies that I have in here. So I move off of this filter, and after I inspect it real quick, I should be able to just take this out. It's going to be sopping wet, but that's okay. And we're going to move down to the bowl. Alright, so we got our sponge filter, and it has a lot of detritus in it, I'm sure. So what we're going to do is put it in the water and give it a light squeeze. See the brownness coming out? Yep. That's all the gunk that this thing captures, because, like I said, sponge filters provide mechanical filtration. So this needs to be done once in a while in order to remove the gunk that this stuff captures. And once the gunk is removed, that will remove the restriction that prevents water from being sucked through the pores of the sponge and pushed out of the outlet. After you've done this, you can take the sponge filter and put it back in place, and do it to the other sponge if you have a dual sponge filter. Sliding it back in place should not be difficult. You just put the hole in the sponge over the little suction cylinder, and there we go. Now, as you do this, it's going to release a bunch of detritus around the tank as well, and it'll float around for a little bit. Don't worry, it's not harmful to your little buddies. After about 20 to 30 minutes, it'll settle back down to the ground or get sucked back onto the surface of the filter here, and your tank will look crystal clear again. Alright, so a quick recap. We've checked the air pump to see if the diaphragms are going bad. We've checked to see if there's any kinks in the airline. We've also removed detritus from the sponge filter to try and remove any restrictions. If the water is still not moving and the bubbles are not plentiful, like they should be, there is more work to be done. It means the blockage is further in the system. So now we're going to have to deconstruct the plastic pieces that make up the sponge filter. So here we have the skeleton structure of the sponge filter. There's a few places where things can get clogged, so we'll start at some of the more obvious spots. Perhaps some algae has grown inside the tube, perhaps something got stuck inside the tube, maybe a snail went through the inlet, maybe something when you were cleaning sponge filters before got sucked into this plastic piece and is now stuck here. There could be an infinite number of possibilities, but luckily these things are designed to be deconstructed. So what we can do is take this piece off right here, as these just more or less snap together. Now, first thing you want to do is run this through some hot water under your sink and then clean really well. And if water flows down through this tube and out of here just fine, the clog is not here. Make sure to do this with the other side if you're running a dual sponge filter setup, to ensure that there are no clogs in either side of that part of the system. Now that we've taken these two parts off, we can set them aside for later. Now, you might think there's not much else to it, but we can remove this headpiece because, as you can see, it extends, and really, it comes apart. Now you're going to want to do the same thing. Go to your sink and pour some really hot water down this tube, and make sure it flows outside of this part of the tube, out the end, freely, making sure there's no restrictions. Once you've done that, you can set this part aside. And yes, we can deconstruct this even further. This piece right here, this clear tube, disconnects from this T-valve. You're going to want to make sure this T-valve is absolutely clear of obstructions as well. Once again, run some hot water through all three of these openings, making sure there's no restriction. And last but not least, this is where what I feel most of the restrictions come from. There's this thin tube right here that's responsible for delivering air from the airline hose from the pump down here and then up here. What I find is a lot of restrictions happen because this tube right here is very thin, and any little bit of anything, whether it's sand, a snail, something that got stuck in there, gets stuck right around here and needs to be cleaned out. So what I recommend doing is putting some hot water through it again, but then close off this end with your finger and blow through this end with your mouth. I'll show you what that looks like. You might think that what I just suggested is a little strange, but putting pressure in the system in this way might free whatever is clogging right around here loose and out this end. So put your finger on this end, keeping the airline hose inlet free, and blow. Now, this is a good thing that I just did that, because as I did that, I could not get air to come out of this end freely. It should be easy to get air to come out that way. It's just a simple air in here, air out there. There's no valves or anything to close, which means that there is something stuck right about here. So, what I've done after running this through some hot water and trying to blow whatever sort of debris might be stuck in it free, that hasn't worked. But you can deconstruct this further. Simply take a tool of some sort, put it over the inlet where you would connect the airline hose, and gently pull. This piece will come out. Voila. Now, check this piece. Air freely moves through this without a problem. So we can set that piece aside and now focus on the only remaining possibility. So what I'm going to do is cap my finger at the end where the air would be going in and then coming out right here, and apply some air pressure with my mouth. It's pretty darn clogged, but now that we have direct access to this, we can use whatever we can find, be it a paper clip or a little pipe cleaner, and get whatever grime is stuck right in here out of there, because that is where the clog is at this point. So I've got a paper clip and the sponge filter, so I'm going to stick the paper clip through here and try and see if there's any blockages that can be undone by fidgeting this around and seeing what may or may not be in there. And on the other side, on the inside, I'm going to try and get around to the hole that this exits through and clear that around too. Now this may take some time to experiment around with and see what works best to unclog it. There's probably some other ideas that you might come up with that would work better than the paper clip, but this method has worked for me in the past. So what I've done is I've turned this paper clip into a bit of a pick of sorts. You see I've bent it at a right angle at the end, and that allows me to go into here and really get into the exit hole of where the air comes into this main tube from where the airline hose would be connected. And that allows me to pick inside and clear out whatever gunk might have built up in there. And after doing so, you might even be able to hear it. I'm starting to get airflow to return to this thing. Now it's not quite perfect yet, so I'm going to keep working on it, but it shows that this is indeed where the clog in the system is. So after giving this thing a thorough picking, I'm going to just reassemble this real quick. Reassembling is just as easy as disassembling. We just take the tube that pushes air through, put it back in place, take the top outlet, push it back down, get our T-valve, snap it back in place. Then we get our parts where the sponge filters connect, squeeze and snap those back in place, and we put the sponge filters back on the little cylinders here, connect the airline hose back up, and let's see if there's any improvements. Bada bing, bada boom, look at that. We have got a ton of airflow again. Just like this tank over here, with the sponge filters on and everything. Now we have returned to the performance back to the sponge filter. And yes, it does take this much to get things working again. If you had a sponge filter for a long time, you will eventually need to work on every system component that we just talked about throughout this video. The one part that we just fixed is the most tedious, but realistically it can be done in about 5 minutes if you have all the tools on hand. However, that being said, that is the diagnostic process you will have to go through to return performance back to your sponge filter. Start with the pump, see if it's bad. Then go to the Airline tubes, see if there's anything wrong with that. Then go to the sponges, see if they need to be cleaned. Then go to the sponge filter system that connects everything together and make sure those pipes are nice and clear, including that really obnoxious little itty-bitty part that we had to pick at in order to get any gunk out to ensure airflow, to make the water flow along with it. But I hope this video was helpful to you guys. I know sometimes this can be frustrating, and I sincerely hope that this helps your little buddies feel a lot better. So, thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, show your friends, check out my other videos. I've got plenty of them, and as always, I'll see you next time. Stay fishy.